Men often criticize women because they feel like they are not feminine enough. In some ways, this is correct. Women are socially conditioned to be strong and independent, often making a girl feel bad about herself for displaying her naturally feminine behavior. And some women today realize that they haven't been happy with men with the dating market. They've come to wonder, well, what does it take to be more feminine and to attract a good man? We are unfortunately broken culturally in a lot of ways. And most people today couldn't really tell you what it means to be feminine. And the problem is that you guys listening right now, you don't know what that would mean to have a feminine woman. Many of you don't know what that would look like, and you don't know what traits you're looking for. Without knowing what to look for, you end up picking girls who give you attention and maybe look sort of hot, but she ends up not being a good match because she isn't comfortable being in her feminine self. She's not comfortable following your lead. And so you end up in these bad relationships. And when you're out in the dating market, you're not really sure what you should be looking for. So we're going to go over some of these traits today. Worth mentioning is now in 2024, most women are pretty well broken or well removed from a lot of attractive as well as optimal behaviors that they would need to have to make a relationship work. So, what this means is you're likely going to have to find somebody who's generally a good girl, who shows capabilities. So, in some ways, you're going to have to train them on how to act, like a dog. No, not like a dog, but you are going to have to lead them in the right direction. How do you lead the woman that you're with into being comfortable in her feminine and having the right kind of behaviors that would be good for a relationship if you don't know what behaviors you're looking for or where it comes from? And so we're going to discuss that today and clear some of this up. And now's a good time to mention, if you want to learn how to do these skills in leading women in your relationships and attracting them and selecting them and all the stuff that you need to be successful today in a long-term relationship or just in the dating market in general, click that link below and join my community for free. So what is femininity? What does that mean? All right. So I was going through YouTube and listening to people trying to answer that question. And I wasn't really coming up with very scientific answers, more anecdotal and observational answers. So I had to ask myself, what is the root of femininity? It's both cultural, it's social, but there's a physical component here as well. So one of the things I do study when learning about the behaviors of men and women is their neurobiology. And men and women are very similar, okay, neurobiologically, but there are some distinct differences. And these differences make the difference when you're talking about communication with each other and figuring out how one another perceives and sees the world and perceives love and relationships, because they aren't exactly the same. And with that, there are behaviors that are distinctly masculine, and that's a cultural thing. But where does this come from? Did we make it up out of thin air? Well, no. These masculine behaviors tend to be traits that more masculine men display. Well, what does that mean? What makes them more masculine? Well, it's those hormonal differences, or more specifically, testosterone, and how the testosterone and other neurochemicals interact with each other in the brain. Well, it's the same with a woman. What makes a woman feminine? Well, we have the social conditioning to say, well, this, that, and the other for a feminine woman. But what's the real answer? Because people like to put in their own ideas of what they think this thing is. In 2024, feminine's good and masculinity is bad. And there's a lot of negative traits and qualities that are ascribed to masculinity, which of course isn't entirely true. That's just the social narrative that we're dealing with. So masculinity is not inherently good or bad. It just is based on testosterone levels and how more dominant or masculine men tend to act. And there are archetypes and stereotypes for feminine women, but those are based in ideas about how women act whose behavior is driven by more of their estrogen and their hormonal profile that makes them a woman. And these hormonal differences are very distinct. Men have between 300 and 1100 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, whereas women only have between 15 and 70 nanogram per deciliter. So for a woman at a high level of testosterone, if a woman is high testosterone, but within a normal range, she still has 4 times less testosterone than the least amount testosterone male if he's in normal range. If a man has a low level of 300 for testosterone, and a woman has a high level, she's at 70. That's a big difference. And that hormonal differences causes different reactions with the neuropeptides in the brain. So what about estrogen? Well, women have between 30 and 400 units of estrogen, and whereas a man has between 10 and 40. Okay. So like 10 and 40 is there's some crossover, high estrogen level males and low estrogen uh, level females. There could be a mild crossover, but most women are well above 30 and at least into the hundreds or 200s with their estrogen levels. And so there's a distinct difference there with the estrogen levels, and that again affects the brain. So now, in studying men and women and femininity versus masculine or dominant behavior, and those tend to go hand in hand. But has anybody taken the time to try to study or look at this stuff and look at how these things influence someone's masculinity or femininity? And it's hard because in the academic world, they don't want to recognize these biological differences between biological males and biological females. That for some reason is controversial. So there's been a lack of recognition of differences in this manner. But there is some stuff that is out there. And Dr. Helen Fisher had come up with her model for piecing people together in a love scenario, right? So Dr. Helen Fisher is an anthropologist, and she came up with 4 love types. And those 4 types were explorer, builder, director, and negotiator. Now, if you want to read more about that, be my guest, do a Google search. I think it gets into a little bit of, we could say, horoscope like thinking, as often happens when we come up with archetypes or when we come up with, when the scientific community even comes up with these personality types, right? And different things like that. It tends to be not nuanced enough to get down to predictive, being able to predict human behavior or even be able to analyze humans in the right way. I don't agree with her prescription when it comes to the 4 love types and how they match together and all this stuff. But I will say, though, that she was on an interesting track by looking at hormonal differences and neuropeptide differences in how that affects behaviors. And the negotiator was someone who has higher estrogen levels. Now, I'm not so sure how she, I've talked to her or anything to know how she considers that with biological sex differences and considers the fact that women have astronomically more estrogen than males. And I don't know if there's a consideration. Well, one of the types is testosterone driven. And similarly, males have astronomically more testosterone than even the most dominant female out there. So I don't know how she washes with that with her types and how she tries to come up with predictions of who's a good fit or match together. I think we get into a little horoscope thinking there. But the idea of looking at estrogen driven behavior is an interesting one. And that put me down the rabbit hole of let's look at what kinds of behaviors that estrogen and higher levels of estrogen cause, and not unhealthy levels or imbalances, but within balanced, healthy levels of estrogen, what do higher levels of estrogen cause? What kinds of behaviors can be attributed to this hormone, right? And if we look at the kinds of behaviors that are attributed to an estrogen dominant uh, hormonal profile versus a testosterone dominant one, then we can potentially decipher, right? What it would mean to be a feminine woman and come up with traits for femininity. So lo and behold, that's what I did. And I looked up their research and figured out what does estrogen cause, not unhealthy levels, because that can cause mentally ill behavior. Okay. But within healthy levels, with a healthy hormonal profile, what does a high estrogen person and with coupled with low testosterone person, which we could just say woman, right? What would that cause? What kind of behaviors would that cause? And more so than somebody else. And that would leave us with feminine traits. That gives us our list of feminine traits. And these traits are a pretty interesting list. We now have a scientific way of looking at femininity, okay, when we look at hormonal profiles. So that being said, I'm going to go over the list for you because it's very useful. And it's useful in figuring out how to lead your relationships, what kind of behaviors you should be expecting, and what kind of behaviors you should be vetting for in the dating market. Because really, if you understand what behaviors are likely to happen with a higher estrogen profile, a person with a higher estrogen profile, then you can set your expectations appropriately and pick a good woman that you'll be attracted to and happy with, even in a long-term relationship and happy over time, right? So let's go through the list. So the list here. So first thing that comes to mind is nurturing behavior. All right. So a feminine woman is nurturing. All right. The higher estrogen levels interact with oxytocin and beta endorphins in a particular way that can make her nurturing, particularly to children, but to animals, to disadvantaged or weaker individuals, to people who need help, right? Like being a nurturing person goes along with femininity. All right. Now, unfortunately, a strong, independent woman might not, might feel like she can't be nurturing, might feel like she can't be caring for somebody, right? At least not a man or one of her girlfriends or whatever. Certainly not a man. Okay. And so that could be problematic, right? Sympathetic. So I say sympathetic to delineate a bit from empathy. There's different ways to look at sympathy, but sympathy is being able to identify with another person's emotions. So if her girlfriend feels bad and is crying, she goes, "Oh, girl, I'm so sorry," and gives her a hug, and she feels sad along with her girlfriend feeling sad. Okay. It's being able to identify those emotions and understand the emotions that somebody's going through. That's an important trait, especially when raising children, right? So that's what makes for good moms is that sympathetic behavior, and that is tends to be more estrogen driven behavior. How about being emotional in general? So higher levels of estrogen leads to more emotionality. That is not a bad thing, though. That's not, it's bad if it's uncontrolled and if it's crazy. Somehow we have conditioned ourselves to believe that having emotions are bad and that women being emotional is a problem. It's not really a problem. It's actually attractive if she's healthy. And if she's a healthy person with emotional maturity, having emotions is what makes her attractive. Being, let's say, sex, right? Being really sexually motivated and attracted to you and horny and all that stuff, and being able to show those feelings is what makes a girl hot in those circumstances. How about just being enjoyable to be around, being able to be happy and being able to feel good? If the emotions are productive and positive and she has good emotional maturity, being emotional is not really a bad thing. It's a feminine trait. All right. We need to celebrate that trait. How about security seeking? So this is seeking safety, seeking security, not being, whereas testosterone tends to be more driven in risk taking. Estrogen driven behavior is less risk taking and more risk averse. And we know that women tend to be more risk averse in their career choices, in their relationship choices a lot of times, and how they choose to build their lives. And a lot of us really driven and crazy guys can, rely on that in a sense in a relationship. That can be a good trait or quality that she brings to the table to sort of temper our risk-taking crazy behavior, right? So, being more risk averse and security seeking, that's a feminine trait. Having good intuition is a feminine trait, because instead of getting into her logical parts of her brain and analyzing things. Not to say a woman can't analyze, right? She's got a high IQ. She can analyze better than guys, depending on the circumstance. But that might not be her default mode or drive if she has high estrogen. More to get a feeling and use her feelings to sort of gauge what decisions to make or her assessment of a situation. So instead of being in her thoughts to assess something, she's in her feelings. And intuition is a good trait for making fast decisions. The reason why we have emotions, in theory, and the reason why they developed is because an emotional response is a faster response, and it gets us to respond faster and keep ourselves alive and respond and react to maybe children, right, faster, so they keep them safe, and so on. So having intuition is not a bad thing. That tends to be more estrogen driven. Not to say everybody with intuition is an S pile estrogen, but being able to have that in default to that is estrogen driven. Being imaginative and being able to get into fantasy and being able to get into magical thinking and some of that stuff, that can be bad, right? Of course, but it can be good too. All right, it can be fun, it can be something worth celebrating, and that's a feminine behavior. It's just a matter of when to use this trait, right? Are we going to use magical thinking to try to solve real world problems? Well, that's probably not a good idea. And so, as long as she knows when to kind of apply this sort of thinking, it's a great trait to have. How about being holistic and seeing the whole experience rather than just the parts? That's another thing too, where guys, we tend to think, especially testosterone driven men, tend to think of things in parts. It's this part, that part, this step, that step. And women tend to see things as a whole experience and see the whole thing together. And it's just a different way of seeing things. This goes into big picture and feelings driven behavior, and having goals and things, and imagining sort of the lifestyle she wants, imagining what it'd be like to have her wedding, or imagining the man that she wants and the lifestyle she wants. Estrogen driven behavior, feminine behavior, they are sympathetic to other people's emotions, which makes them empathetic communicators, meaning they are concerned about the other person's feelings. And so they're trying to identify those feelings and be able to communicate with them in a way that they understand. Women tend to be wired towards this empathetic communication. And the more feminine the woman, the more concerned she's going to be about the other person's feelings when she interacts and talks with them. And this also makes her more agreeable. All right. So women who are feminine tend to be more agreeable, and because they tend to care about the feelings of the other person that they're having the conversation with. And that's a very feminine, estrogen driven behavior. All right. So empathy, in the pure sense of being able to put themselves in another person's shoes, is not necessarily a female trait. In fact, a lot of women struggle with that. But in the social interaction, though, they're identifying the emotions and then trying to communicate in such a way that it makes the other person feel good or feel better. Okay. So that's where that communication comes from a feminine woman, which is why talking to a nice feminine woman is a very pleasant experience. And a lot of women today who suppress this part of them are unpleasant to talk to a lot of times. Altruism can be estrogen driven. Now, that could be something that could be probably driven in different ways, but the idea or want to take care of the disadvantaged, the weaker, or just people in need, especially in the tribe or in the community, wanting to help another person, wanting to take care of somebody in some way or offer help in some way that, help somebody who's in need, that sort of, identifying with those emotions and what that person must be going through and then wanting to help them. That's a part of female behavior, that sometimes, guys might miss that stuff, right? And so a really feminine woman oftentimes is very good at remembering someone's birthday. I mean, think about this: how many guys forget anniversaries, forget birthdays, they forget that shit even amongst their guy friends. Like, think of dudes and birthdays. How many dudes give a crap about their other guy friend's birthday? I can't remember the last time I gave a shit about it, my own or other dudes. But almost universally, all the girls I know remember their friends' birthdays. Oh, it's so and so's birthday. I'm going to do a surprise for them, or I'm going to call them on their birthday. They remember that stuff because they're sensitive to other people in the group, and that can make them altruistic as well. That can make them diplomatic as well. So, in working in groups or any kind of group activity, guys can be very driven towards the goal, and they could, not really care about the feelings of the other people as they drive towards that goal, especially the higher up the testosterone levels go up and the lower those estrogen levels go down for a guy, which is why a guy does need a little bit of estrogen mixed in with that testosterone, or he's not going to be a healthy person. But with women, yeah, higher, more feminine women are going to be very diplomatic in groups because they want to make sure everyone's voice is heard. They want to make sure everybody is considered, and they want to do what's good for everybody. Not always what's good for the results or the goal, but what's fair or what's equal to everybody, those sorts of things. And that can be a good or bad quality depending on how it's being used, right? How about people pleasing behavior, or being a good host, or being caretaking? Now, a feminine woman could be susceptible. She has to be careful about her boundaries, because a feminine woman could be susceptible to getting walked on, stepped on, not considered and taken advantage of because of this caretaking type of behavior. But it is a good trait, though. In fact, it's an excellent trait that many guys, that are in happy relationships, rely on their woman for. The girl that is a good host, that if a friend or somebody stops by, or if you have some of the boys over, she's offering snacks, she's offering drinks, she's considering, the person's experience as a host, right? That's a feminine thing, to do that. And it's great. It's a great quality. And you can tell a lot about somebody with how they treat a guest. I think it's a pretty true statement, man or woman. It's just a good person quality. But women tend to be very good at the hosting thing, and they can tend to want to people please a little bit too, which can get them in trouble, right? But that's estrogen driven behavior, being sensitive to social groups. So, that means being sensitive to criticism. That means being sensitive to not being seen as a good person, or not being seen in a good light. That could be a thing, right? And so, being sensitive in general, being polite and proper. How many girls out there today in westernized culture, whatever, our United States or Australia, or England, or whatever, like Western Europe, how many women I mean, do you catch on TikTok, or do you catch on reels or different things, acting just like ratchet? Or if you ever go to the club or the bars nowadays, how many loud, especially in the United States, and especially in middle America, how many loud mouth, ratchety women are just out there, just running their mouths, being impolite, being ratchet? That is a turnoff to most men, right? They just that bitchy, rah, rah, rah. Like, I mean, that's a turnoff. And it's a turnoff because if you're a man with masculine traits, that is like that is like nails to a chalkboard, right? Because it's the opposite of feminine behavior, right? Feminine behavior, as there's throw some estrogen in a girl's voice, and her voice sounds more womanly, sounds more girl like, which is attractive. Men respond to sound in that way, right? Our attractiveness signals respond very well to a girl's voice. But now add other elements to that, like being polite, right? And being somewhat proper. That is a feminine behavior because she doesn't want to. I mean, even if she's like a dirty little slut, like behind closed doors, right? Which is also a great trait to have, ladies. But, being polite, proper, and respectable in person, that's really a feminine thing. Why is that? Because women are who a feminine woman is more sensitive to social opinions, more sensitive to what's going on in the social environment. And so she doesn't want to look like this ratchet person who's, two sheets to the wind, drinking too many shots and screaming across the bar. Like that's not feminine behavior, right? And a lot of girls, they think that's cool now because they associate that with being like a strong, bitchy woman or something. It's not cool. It's actually really unattractive. Leads to the next thing that women feel conflicted about being outside of the bedroom, which is submissiveness. Being submissive is a feminine, estrogen driven thing. Okay. Being in her emotions, being more nurturing, being more caring, being more sensitive means that sometimes it's going to be harder for her to make decisions and to be analytical decision type A type people, right? And so for a feminine woman, she enjoys having leadership be that person for her and then supporting that leadership. It fits well with the hormonal profile of a feminine woman, which is to be a good help and support to the type A decision maker, not to be the type A decision maker herself. And in fact, if you put her in the position of being that, which a lot of guys do because they don't know how, men today a lot of times don't know how to have any backbone, and they are either too much or too little, right? They don't know how to communicate well. So small things like where do you want to go eat for dinner can be arguments because the guy's like, where do you want to go? Where do you want to go? And he's not making decisions. And she doesn't want to be that person. She wants to be, she wants the decision to feel good to her. All right. And she doesn't want to have to make it. And this is part of that submissive behavior. Right. So you have to get a lot of you guys are not used to handling a woman who could be or wants to be submissive, which, by the way, to some degree is most women. Now, as far as being feminine, we could look at this at a scale, right? Some women are going to be really feminine and some women not so much. And some of that might be driven by their levels of estrogen and testosterone. That being said, some women, and there's also dopamine and serotonin and the reward system and how that interacts with these hormones too. But some women, just like submission or dominance, there's going to be a scale there as well. And that's what we call, I'm going to take a little left turn here to talk about the power dynamic. Okay. Power dynamic is something that is not being talked about enough in relationship psychology. And it is critically important to having a healthy relationship. There's a certain level of power through dominance that one person in the relationship wants to have and feels comfortable with. And there's a certain level of support and submission that the other half of that relationship wants to have. So for a two-person relationship, okay, we'll assume, and male-female relationship, generally speaking, the male tends to be the more dominant figure in the relationship and be more comfortable because of his testosterone levels and hormonal profile, more comfortable with that dominance. And the woman is to a degree submissive. Now it's to a degree. Some women are, they only really want to be 60% submissive. If you looked at I don't know, a scale or something, right? So some women want to be 90, 95% submissive, like some women are very, very submissive and very comfortable there. Some women lose a bit of a comfort level being there. And it's hard to tell which, because there's the natural state based on genetics, hormones, and what feels right to her. And then there's the behavioral conditioning. And women are trained by society to not be submissive. Being submissive is seen as not being strong and not being that strong, independent woman archetype, which every woman, whether they realize it or not, is aspiring and trying to be because they've been told that that's what makes them valuable, right? But that it's not really what makes them valuable. That narrative is kind of a broken narrative. And you can be strong and submissive. You can be both. In fact, to be very submissive often takes a lot of internal strength. All right. A lot of women don't understand that. But I don't want to get down the rabbit hole of power dynamic, but you just need to know and understand that it's there. And you need to figure out where you're most comfortable in terms of your level of dominance in the relationship. Understanding this, that more levels of dominance means more effort and management of the relationship. A lot of guys are not ready for that. Okay. And picking a girl who is in her comfort zone of having a certain level of submissiveness, right? And she may not know what that is because of the social conditioning. So she's going to probably have to break outside of that conditioning to figure it out. And well, now that's part of your relationship journey with whoever you're with. But I digress. Submissiveness is a part of the equation for having that feminine behavior. All right. Being trusting or traumatized. All right. It can go either way. So being more feminine means that it might be easier for her to be trusting. It might be easier because she's in her emotions. So when she feels good about somebody or good about something, there's a tendency to automatically want to trust that person based on her feelings. Now, the contrary side of that is if she's been burned a lot, traumatized, came from a bad family, had bad men in her life, so on and so forth, in the relationship with you, she's not going to easily be trusting. She's instead going to behave as if she is traumatized. Okay. And so instead of easily trusting and being in her emotions, she's going to be easily acting like a traumatized person. And she'll be easily acting as if you're doing something bad or wrong when you're not, being overly sensitive and overly protective and not trusting at all, which can be a very big hurdle to overcome. And in fact, this is a difficult one for many men because being feminine is so attractive to a man that he gets in these relationships with feminine women who are in fact traumatized. And because of their trauma, they can't trust and they do so many unhealthy behaviors because of it. So they're unable to just follow a strong lead who is trustworthy, who I hope is you, right? You're being a trustworthy guy and you're being a strong lead that makes her attracted to you, but that lack of trust due to her trauma makes her a bad match because then she does all these toxic behaviors and emotionally erratic behaviors and takes you on a roller coaster of drama because of all this trauma and traumatic way of thinking. And that's tough because now you're attracted because of her feminine behavior. You're very attracted to her, but because of the trauma, she's not a good match. And so you struggle with, should I stay in this relationship to get her to work through this trauma and then be a good match? Or do I leave and run for the hills? And at what point do I make these decisions? This is a struggle for a lot of men. All right. So that's another reason to join my community for free on School if this has been a struggle for you. And that leads us to the next thing, which is just being sensitive in general. And I don't mean that in a bad or a good way, but just being very aware, very sensitive, and very affected, right, by what others think. And that means in a relationship, if she's a feminine woman, she's going to need your reassurance and she's going to need your validation. And she may need that very often. She might need that a lot more often than what you are normally comfortable doing or thinking about. And that's something for you to gauge. And that's when you learn how to have frame and when you learn good relationship game, you're able to gauge how much is too much in terms of validation and how much is too little. All right. So these are skill sets you get to learn. So that about covers, I mean, there might be more on a list, okay, but that about covers feminine behavior. What makes for a feminine woman? I gave you a nice, comfortable list to follow. It's not just my opinion based on what I think a woman should be like. There is no judgment or value judgment here as I'm having this conversation with you. That's an important thing to note because when we start talking about femininity, masculinity, alpha male behavior or beta male behavior, there becomes a lot of judgment and not a lot of data, right? And so what I'm giving you today is data driven information. All right. This is based on neuroscience, based on hormonal levels and biology and estrogen levels, and some of the traits that higher estrogen, lower testosterone causes in the brain, and how that shows up in behavior. So now you have a nice, comfortable list. Well, thanks for listening, and hopefully you find this list helpful and you find this analysis something you can use for your dating life and your relationships. Don't forget to join my community for free and to get more, and I'll see you next time.